Let's discuss creating trans superhero characters. And if your first thought is, why bother? I recommend that you check out my video on becoming a superhero because I discuss at some length the meta-narrative of exclusion and the need for diversity. In summary, though, creating diverse characters creates different points of conflict, different points of view, and that's where we get more interesting, more robust stories. And from a social point of view, having representation for all different kinds of people in media makes for a better world. If you've watched my video on creating characters with disabilities, in there I discuss first some of the existing issues in the comic book industry related to characters with disabilities. Then I move on to introducing some original characters. In this video, by contrast, I'm just going to dive into a couple of original characters using the same kind of rules. So they're going to be primary heroic characters. They're not tokens. I'm not going to use villains or supporting characters. I want to focus on frontline heroes. If you're interested in learning more about existing problems with trans representation in comic books, check the links in the description. Okay, character number 1, Rosette is a trans woman. And what this means to me is that society and family, doctors, that kind of thing, they labeled her as male when she was born, and this isn't her actual gender, and she happens to be female. And it's as simple as that, at least from my point of view. Rosette is a guns and armor, vigilante, mercenary anti-hero, reminiscent of characters like Punisher, Silver Sable, Solo, Deadpool, Deathstroke. She has a strong military background and uses this knowledge to lethally combat villains. I'm not getting into her backstory, powers, abilities, anything like that. But in the near future, I'm going to be doing spotlights on each of my original characters within my world, covering their powers, abilities, costumes, story arc, and etc. For this topic, we're just talking about gender of these characters. In a better world, I would just say that she's a woman, leave it at that, because trans women are women, and you don't need more information. The key question should be, is the character's gender arc a component of their heroic arc or not? But we don't live in that better world, so we might need to lean in. We might need to make sure that we've addressed the character's gender as part of our story so that people have more opportunity to see these characters in media. Fortunately for us, when you look at heroic characters with the military background, a major part of the trope is telling the story through flashback sequences and remembrances. And this is often meant to sort of parallel the echoes of trauma that can result from military service, right? It's part of the post-war experience that we've kind of built into a lot of these characters. This gives us an immediate way to reveal pieces of Rosette's past without needing to shoehorn anything into the present, right? Because in the present, I don't need to address the fact that she's a trans woman. Through the flashback storytelling, I can introduce the concept to the reader without having to make it a focus of her present-day arc. The audience learns that she's a trans woman by seeing elements of her past, and you can make the connections yourself, a show-don't-tell methodology. And the simple fact that she's trans is not treated as an unusual thing. But then we get to the big question many of you are asking. What's in her pants? Am I right? She's got breasts, so what's going on downstairs? And I'm not going to tell you. That information is not part of her heroic journey. Let me ask you something. Does the Punisher have a penis? Many people answer, of course. But what are you basing that on? And if you're thinking that it's because he had a wife and kids, his children weren't babies. And we don't know how he came to have children. We just know that he has them. We don't know whether or not they were adopted. We don't know whether or not they had to go to some kind of clinic to get help. We have no idea about that. For all we know, he used to have a penis, and he lost it in the war due to a mine or a grenade or who knows what. When you look at him in a costume, he looks like a Ken doll. And this is true for superheroes in general. We don't explicitly know what's going on in their pants. People just make the assumption. They just fill in the blanks. But for some reason, people are obsessed with the genitals of certain people. Just a small group of people that some people very much want to know what's going on downstairs. This is a problem that our society needs to get over. People need to not be obsessed with what's in other people's pants. Unless those people invite you into their pants, the contents therein are none of your business. We have a female superhero who is reminiscent of the Punisher or Silver Sable, and we learn through some flashback storytelling that she used to be male identified, and then we move forward with the story. That is Rosette, and as I say, I will be doing a future spotlight on her story and her abilities and what makes her tick. So feel free, if you're interested, leave a comment, consider subscribing, and follow along. Okay, number 2, Paolo. And this is not Paolo's superhero name. This is his everyday alter ego name. And I'm not going to be talking about superhero name because Paolo is an interesting case. Paolo is a trans man. That's not what makes it an interesting case. It's just a fact that he is a trans man. Paolo was born Paula. And unlike Rosette, his gender identity is actually central to his heroic arc. If you're cisgendered, you might be afraid to try and tell stories where trans identity or gender identity in any way is central to an arc. And I'm going to encourage you not to be afraid to do it. I mean, imagine if all superhero creators were trans. Would you want them to only make trans characters? Or would you be asking them to make cisgendered characters? And you probably would, because of course you would. So obviously, the reverse is true. And for most people, it's probably just never been pointed out to them that way. They've never seen it because the underlying assumption, the thing that people treat as normal or obvious or to be assumed, is that everybody's cisgendered, all the characters are cisgendered, everything's just cisgendered, that's just the default. That's not accurate to reality. It's just how people behave. It is what society has adopted as a stance. That doesn't make it observably true in the world around us. It's just a bunch of assumptions built on top of assumptions, oftentimes based on inaccurate information. So yes, cisgendered creators, in my opinion, should make transgendered and non-binary characters. All creators of all types, of all genders and agenders, of all sexualities and asexualities, of all ethnicities, should be making characters that are representative of the world around us. Characters from all walks of life, not just characters that are most like them. You might make mistakes. You might offend people. I am definitely making mistakes. I'm definitely going to offend some people. And that's life. We can't let fear of failure prevent us from challenging ourselves to create better. So I persevere and I make characters and I talk about creating characters with disabilities and creating characters of different ethnicities and creating trans characters and run the risk of offending people in those communities that I'm trying to give better representation to. Because if I don't risk offending them, I risk alienating them. And it's better, ultimately, in my opinion, that I risk offending them than I risk alienating them further. And I feel like they've had enough. And they shouldn't have to endure more because I'm afraid. So, if you're cisgendered and you're a creator, please try it. Take the chance. Take the risk. You'll learn something about yourself and about your world. So, we've got this second character, Paolo. And although Paolo is living as a man, he hasn't started HRT, or hormone replacement therapy, when we first meet him. And that's sort of next steps for him in his everyday life. But then the event occurs. And to really glaze over it, the event in my comic world is essentially magic has returned to the world. So overt magic, big things, people throwing fireballs, that kind of stuff. It turns out that Paolo's family were guardians of an ancient power. With overt magic returning to the world, Paolo's magical inheritance manifests itself as kind of like an energy being, like a second spirit that's bonded to him and gives him superpowers. Unfortunately, the spirit entity that bonds to him is both female identified and sort of attuned to the female gender, and it passes matrilineally through the family. There is no magical transformation that occurs with Paolo's powers. And if Paolo chooses to proceed with HRT, he has no idea whether his powers will weaken or even leave. or if he'll somehow destroy this magical inheritance and end the family's tradition. And this becomes the allegory for the process of not conforming to society's expectations. Because I wanted to talk about this struggle, but I wanted to do so without bringing in Paolo's family and deciding on the spot how they may or may not react and trying to craft the details of a familial narrative that I don't have firsthand experience with. But also, another reason, because family is only one part of that story. The foundation of this story is something we all experience, right? We reach a point in our lives where we have to choose whether or not we're going to conform to the expectations of our families, of our friends, of society at large. And this choice, for some people, is apparently really easy, and so they play it down. But they're ignoring the reality that this is a question of power. There are two doors. One means conforming to the expectations and pressures of the world, and you will be rewarded with worldly privilege. That's power. Those who conform, they get some power. That's why it's so appealing to so many people. But for many, it's not an easy choice. For many, conformity is at best something that can be done briefly, and doing it takes a tremendous psychological toll. It is essentially impossible for them to do it for any prolonged period of time. It's like drowning. But the other door is rejection and loss. Nonconformists lose privilege, and they lose power, and most importantly, they lose basic social resources we all depend on. And part of that is the potential loss of family and everything that means. The loss of community, the loss of support, the loss of resource, the loss of understanding. That is what Paolo faces. That is the decision he has to make. And this is not a gender swap fairy story. He won't suddenly want to be a woman just because there are these new benefits to it. There were always underlying social benefits to him conforming, and that hasn't changed. So how does Paolo resolve this conflict? Part of me is tempted to say, come back, I'll do a spotlight, and I'll answer that question, but I also don't think that that's a fair way to end this story. Paolo goes through with the change. He goes through with HRT to express his own true identity, regardless of the cost, regardless of what might be lost, because it's who he is. His gender arc coincides with his heroic arc, and he's telling the story of heroism, and deeply embedded in our social understanding of what heroism is, starts with honesty, and that means honesty with yourself. And honesty with the world about who you are. As a hero, how can he not be true to who he is and show the world the reality of that? How can he not go down that road and still be a hero? And that's part of his realization, part of his heroic journey, is realizing that it doesn't matter what power he's being offered. To be a hero, a real hero, he must begin with the truth. So, those are a couple of the characters I've made that are trans-identified. One, we're given a nod to the fact that the individual is transgendered, and the other, it's part of the character's story arc. I talk about that as well in creating characters with disabilities, about whether or not the character and their arc needs to include why they happen to be, for instance, in a wheelchair, or if they suffered some kind of trauma, do we have to see the aftermath of that trauma because it's part of their heroic arc, or can we just let it be in the background? Because we all have traumatic experiences in our background, and they don't all have to be part of every hero's story. The same is true of all of the choices and decisions a character makes. We've got to be careful to not overemphasize or overexamine these things in our stories. We include them, we make sure that they're represented, but we don't overfocus on them, because overfocusing on any one thing starts to make it appear to the audience as though we're treating it like some kind of oddity. And being trans isn't an oddity, it's normal. And increasing the representation is about increasing that understanding of normalcy. When people think of any people under the LGBT umbrella, they often have feelings like, this is something I'm not used to, this is outside of my norm. And a big part of that is because of the lack of representation historically. If you'd grown up in a world where the media had equal representation of LGBT individuals that existed in the world, if the representation in media was the same as what's in the real world, right now, you wouldn't think it was abnormal. You wouldn't think it was unusual because you would have already seen a media reflection of normalcy instead of a media reflection of a bizarre, false, puritanical worldview. Because I need to stress this, the worldview was false. It didn't represent the world. When we say things like, let's make our media representative, we're really saying, let's make our media honest. And if you are opposed to honest media, you have bigger problems. I'd look into it. As ever, thank you for your time, and I hope thought was provoked.